Very interesting question. I recently attended a conference in London, which was mostly about point source carbon capture. So I had an opportunity to really understand that industry, the point source industry, and compare it against the DAC industry. So what are the differences between point source and DAC? And the really big difference is that in point source, the carbon capture happens at the point at which the carbon is emitted, right? So typically a power plant or a cement plant or an industrial facility. And then you have to transport the CO2 to using pipelines to some point of sequestration. And that process of moving the CO2 is a major problem. And it's a major problem in Europe and in all industrialized countries, because building pipelines like this is very difficult. And you have to get social acceptance that this is something that the community through which the pipeline will pass will accept. So not only is there an acceptance issue with point source and the transportation of CO2, but there's also the problem of quality. And it means that if you have multiple emitters sharing one pipeline, then there are concerns about safety. And you have to ensure the same standard of CO2 is injected into the pipeline all through the system. Otherwise, you can get problems which can result in safety issues. So it's not, it's a very clumsy approach to carbon capture and storage. The beauty of the DAC system is you locate the DAC farms right beside the point at which you're going to either sequester the carbon or put it into a tank to go offshore to a ship. So you don't have to move the CO2. That's the whole point. So you capture it from the air and you store it on site, and then you inject it into the ground underneath if you're doing geological mineralization, or you simply send it to a ship because the plant is located beside a port. So that's the big difference between the two systems. Cost of the capture of CO2 from DAC is higher, but when you take into account the transportation difficulties associated with point source, I think the price gap has narrowed quite remarkably. So I think there's a really good economic case for looking at DAC, and obviously there is a much far superior environmental case for the use of DAC than the use of point source. Since many of these geological formations that are suitable for mineralizing CO2 are in remote areas, it means that your DAC farms are in remote areas, so they're not interfering with the cities and towns and the areas where people live. That's number one. And number two, you're not using power from the grid, because you can have remote off-grid solar farms and wind farms servicing these remote DAC farms, which is a really important point as well. So that you can imagine that you know, there's a big discussion at the moment in the renewable industry, which is all about how do you get grid connections. Now, getting grid connections is really difficult. So we could deploy far more solar farms and far more wind farms in remote areas if they didn't have to get grid connections. So we can now do that with DAC farms. We can set up DAC farms in remote locations, and we can use off-grid solar and wind to power these farms. So I think that is a real positive as well, because it means we're not interfering with the power demands of the national grid of each country. The big oil companies are putting money into point source because they're trying to get compliant on the emissions. So they have to capture their emissions, or they have to try to capture their emissions. So that is going to go. So the money from big oil essentially goes into point source, right? And all of the services company that service the oil and gas industry, because all the big companies, all the big money is behind point source, right? So that's the noise that people are hearing. Nobody's hearing from the DAC community because it's too small. It's only beginning, and they don't have any one industry behind them. So it's very interesting. So this is why we have to beat our own drum and let people know how great this industry is and how important it is for the future of climate change.